and go.
All right, hello and welcome everybody. We are so glad to have you joining us today for this conversation about the power of participatory grant making. My name is Andrea Berry and I'm the Director of Community Engagement at Maine Initiatives for the next 2 days. Then I'll be moving over to the Wild Seed Project as the new Executive Director. But right now, I am definitely wearing that Maine Initiatives hat as I welcome all of you to this conversation about the power and opportunity of participatory grant making, both from the funder's perspective as well as from the community perspective. So we're really thrilled to be here with you today. We are going to be running our session. We'll kick things off. We're all going to introduce ourselves. There's folks from multiple foundations and different parts of this work here on the call with us today. Then we're going to talk a little bit about participatory grant making as a tool and as a practice within philanthropy. We will definitely, we promise, touch on some of the logistics and the how-tos of this rather complicated type of model of giving out funds and bringing in community to that decision making. And then we'll close with some talk about how in the world we get started and make sure that we leave time for questions. So as we jump in, I'd just like to invite all of you to, all of our speakers to introduce yourselves. And so I'll model first, and then we can jump in and we'll pass from person to person. So we're going to both share our organization and our name, introduce ourselves with our pronouns, and then answer the question, which is, what motivates us to do participatory grant making? So again, I'm Andrea Berry, and I'm the Director of Community Engagement with Maine Initiatives. And for the last 5 years, I've been the prime architect of our organization's participatory grant-making program called Grants for Change. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm really thrilled to be doing this work. Perfect. Hello, Sabrina. So for me, the thing that motivates me and our organization around participatory grant making is the desire to shift the power of who decides what is best for community. And we fully believe that community is who should be directing what community work happens, and that it is the fallacy of philanthropy that philanthropy knows best. And so I really, truly believe in participatory grant making as a way to change the power dynamics and to change who decides. And now I'd love to invite Jamie to talk about Haymarket and your work.
Great, thank you. So my name is Jamie Smith. I use the she, her, hers pronoun series. I am the grants director at Haymarket People's Fund. So Haymarket is a nonprofit foundation, and we make grants to groups across New England. So all 6 New England states is our funding area. And we fund groups that are primarily doing anti-racism, grassroots organizing. So that's kind of our issue focus. In Haymarket, we're kind of unique because Haymarket, from its beginning, we're about 47 years old, and from its beginning, it's always done participatory grant making. So to us, it's just grant making. It's just how we've always done it. And it's always been a very intentional model that with the thought process that people from the community should be making the decisions about where resources should go in their community, that they're the experts and they have the knowledge to determine that. And a group from the outside shouldn't be coming in and telling, community, what needs to be done. And it also goes along with our values and criteria around, self-determination and accountability, really wanting, leadership of those most impacted being decision makers in all aspects. So that's kind of core to who Haymarket is. And we will definitely get into more of this, but I will pass it to Chinravi, who is actually a member of Haymarket's funding panel.
Thanks, Jamie. My name is Chinravi Prong. I hail from Providence, Rhode Island. I use she, her pronouns. I have two roles, both as a board member, brand new to the board, but most importantly, as a New England funding panelist, coming directly out of community organizing work in Rhode Island. And so I believe participatory grant making is core in one and Andrea said, but also centering the voices of those directly impacted by the issues and giving power to the people on the ground. But I also align very much with Haymarket's values of like anti-racism, consensus process making, and multicultural analysis in philanthropic spaces. And I will pass it to Sabrina.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. My name is Sabrina Hunt. I am a member of the Grantmaking Committee for the SEED grants through the New England Grassroots Environment Fund. So this is my second round working as a SEED Grantmaker Committee member. And I also have served at least one, I think it is 2 rounds of the GROW grant in person. So I've been involved with the organization for about 3 years now. And so, yeah, I think that I definitely have a lot of experience just with like the grant making process in a couple different capacities, because before this, I was heavily involved with the Maine Environmental Education Association. So I also know from the perspective of grant writing and submitting the application. So it's kind of coming full circle now that I've been more involved with the grant decision-making side of things. And I will pass to Bart.
Thanks, Serena. Hi, everybody. I'm Bart Vezek. Use he, him, his pronouns. And I'm Director of Operations with the New England Grassroots Environment Fund. And I think I'm just echoing what everybody already shared. The sort of nothing about us without us philosophy is really what underlies the motivation of participatory decision-making, grant-making. As a funder, we are an environmental justice funder as well, and the environmental justice framework is really around those most impacted by environmental degradation should be part of decision making, and that across the entire process. So it's grant making, it's making decisions on who receives funding, but it's also making decisions around what should the guideline be, what should the application look like, what does reporting look like. So how does this really become an ethos that permeates throughout the entire organization has been a lot of the work for the last 3 to 4 years with folks like Sabrina that are really involved and have conversations about a whole range of things, which the thing that motivates me ultimately on a personal level is just the energy, the depth of conversations we get to have when we're in these committee calls or in these committee conversations and multi-day retreats to really kind of dig into some really complex and very nuanced issues and hear from all these different perspectives. To sort of sit in the muck and the chaos of what it can look like on the ground. Because there's usually those applications that are obvious and obvious no's, but 2/3 of them are kind of in that gray area. And how do you really explore that gray area that in a way that's values driven, values aligned, and centers justice and equity is truly what motivates me in the. And pass it to Katie.
Hi, everyone. I'm so glad to be here. My name is Katie Love, and I use she, her pronouns. I'm coming to you from the West Coast of the US. I am currently an independent consultant working with funders and philanthropic organizations interested in exploring participation in philanthropy. And at heart, I am a true nerd, lover, passionate advocate for participation across many things in life, and especially philanthropy. I actually started in philanthropy at a wonderful grant-making organization, but found myself a bit uncomfortable with the power that had landed in my lap and tried to do my best to explore ways that I could use that power for good. But over time, I actually learned about this thing that many of y'all had been doing on this panel for many, many years called participatory grant-making. And since then, I think I've participated in or designed or led more than 40 different processes. So I guess what motivates me is just the wonderful humans and the messiness that Bart mentioned of that process, the human energy and connection. Every single one is special and unique. And I actually come to this role most directly from Wikipedia, where the grant making programs that I helped to run there were all done the same way as Wikipedia, created by the people, for the people, transparently, with shifting power as a main goal, diversity, transparency, and accountability as other goals too. And that's it. Back to you, Andrea.
Thank you so much. And just for all of you who are with us today, I just want to invite you into this conversation. Please do use the chat as we go through. We're going to explore a lot of different questions and share with you our perspectives. But I know that many of you, as I look through that attendee list, you've participated in participatory grant making. You have roles in philanthropy. You have roles as organizations seeking grants. And we want this as much as we can to be a conversation. So please do use the chat as well as the question and answer field for specific questions that you want to flag for us either while we go through this conversation or specifically we have that time at the end. So I really do encourage you to do that. Even though we can't see your faces, we want to hear your voice in this conversation. And one of the ways that we really hope to use this dialogue as a model for you, each of us have different that we look to ask and to explore as a group. And so I'm actually going to invite Katie to ask the first question on our list.
Mute to do that. But the first question that we wanted to talk about is the basics here. What does participatory grant making mean? And what does it look like? So like Andrea said, would welcome everyone who has a thought or an opinion or a reaction to what we're saying to weigh into the chat, because y'all, we are really about participation, and talking this through together gives us so much joy. Being challenged gives me a lot of joy as well. But just to start, I'd like to offer a definition that comes from the Grantcraft Guide, which is a great place to start for anyone interested in exploring. There's a Grantcraft Guide called Deciding Together, and it's run by Candid, which I highly recommend. And the way that this Grantcraft Guide that features many of the funders represented here today proposes that we consider this is about shifting power, that it's when a funder cedes decision-making power about grant funds to communities impacted by those funds. That's at its core what we're talking about. I think there's a range of experiences and participation strategies in philanthropy that many of us have used in our grant making, whether it be in the criteria setting and the guidelines, maybe it's in the evaluation, maybe it's in the board. There are so many ways that participation can show up in philanthropy. But at its core, participatory grant making is about moving power from traditional institutions that have had it to people impacted by those decisions, often folks with the lived experience of injustice, the lived expertise that funders often may not have. So who better than people with that lived expertise to make those decisions about grant funding? The reason I wanted to offer, a few reasons to offer about why you might consider doing this kind of work are, well, there are many reasons. Again, would love for you all to share your ideas in the chat too. But I believe that this is truly a more just and more effective way of doing philanthropy. There are so many benefits, both for the funders and for the participants, the community members, the committee members, the panelists. One is that there is often a more deep and strategic analysis for the grants. There's also a better opportunity to take risks in this kind of funding because there are more eyes on those grant opportunities. We see that there are many ways that movements can be built through this kind of process. And we also see that many people who participate learn from the experience or grow in their leadership. Often people who haven't seen that black box inside of philanthropy get a better understanding of how philanthropy works and can apply that to their own movement building work. We do see, as many of the panelists mentioned too, that this is a real chance for funders to live into their values and to show what it looks like to move power and to take risks in that space. And I'm going to give the question to you, Bart, now for the next question.
Thanks, Katie. The next question we have on our list is, what are the core values that drive the decision to support participatory grant making? And how does participatory, how do a participatory approaches support diversity, inclusion, and or equity? So I think, as I mentioned earlier, for the Grassroots Fund, that really revolves around environmental justice framework, which looks at those most impacted by environmental degradation should be part of the process of decision making across the entire process. And I think it's an interesting piece for us to really ground in that environmental justice framework, because there are participatory grant making can mean so many things, and it becomes a hard thing to really define, pin down. I think it's operationalized in a variety of ways. I think there is a spectrum. I think, Katie, you talked about that as well. You know, there's sort of the idea of informing, of voices, but sticking with a certain process. There's sort of a consulting, more advisory role that emerge in some cases as well, where ultimate decision making is held within a certain group. There are varieties where people are more involved in the decision-making process, but certain parameters are not on the table to talk about more. Things like guidelines or reporting requirements. There's like requiring a 501c3 for an applicant or a fiscal sponsor when most foundations are able to give directly to unincorporated groups. These are all things that can be decided before a process even gets started, that in many ways already limits what is possible and how you show up as a philanthropist. And then there's the decision-making process itself, and really kind of looking at the pre-grant, grant review, and post-grant process, and starting to identify intentional spaces around where and how people are able to show up and truly participate. And I think that's really, for us, how some of our core values of environmental justice really showed up. If it is about those most impacted by environmental degradation showing up in that decision-making role, then it means we have to really start to reflect on our processes and really be able to name what spaces are we creating for folks to truly and meaningfully look at those guidelines, look at the priority areas that we're seeing, in some ways even looking at our budgeting process in terms of how much money is made available to go out for a grant. How do we really structure all of those decision points that exist throughout the entire process in a way where people can truly and meaningfully weigh in? So for us, that looks like having a longer period for decision making. We have a multi-day retreats, which I know Main Initiatives does as well. And we really create intentional space there as well, again, for meaningful participation by having shared trainings around bias, implicit bias in decision making, white supremacy culture and adultism, shared language so people can really have a different way of interacting and naming things as they come up. And we also spend a lot of time kind of talking about overarching trends. How do we collectively as a group want to think about last year, for example, COVID is a really good example. How do we want to think about COVID and how that's going to impact how we want to do grant making? That's not something that we wanted to just say as an organization, how to move that forward, but how do we really involve the folks on the ground into some of those decision making pieces? And then only after all of that, we start to look at the final decisions that we want to make on specific applications as a way for our values to really show up. Not rush into that final piece to just make it about the grant making, but to really open it up for a lot of process pieces throughout the process. And you know how equity, how justice shows up. A lot of that is around really attention to who shows up in those spaces. That means doing surveys and asking people to self-identify across a number of demographic characteristics, including race, ethnicity, age, socioeconomic status, etc. And really sitting with those questions and really honoring the nuance of all of that, how we use that information. But it's a way for us to hold up a mirror to say whose lived experience truly in the room can really weigh in, can really participate. As we kind of look at how groups are composed and we really center certain voices in decision making. So I'll leave it at that. Do we want to pass it around to other folks and see, Jamie or John Ravi? I don't know if you have sort of a similar perspective from Haymarkets on that particular question.
Ravi, you want to take it or are you passing it to me?
Pass it in, I'll follow up.
Okay. So Haymarket, as I said, we've been doing participatory grant making for since we've existed, but anti-racism is a core value of Haymarket, and so that's threaded through everything we do as an organization, and especially the work of the funding panel. So it's core to our own. We have principles and values that we follow as an organization, and as part of a process, it was a collaborative process. We when Haymarket went through its anti-racism transformation, we updated all of our funding criteria to reflect that. So but we also made sure what we weren't asking of our grantees, we weren't doing ourselves internally. So we spent a lot of time as an organization, and we still say we're on an anti-racism journey because we haven't, fixed all the problems and figured everything out. But it's definitely a process that we're part of, and we intertwine that into everything we do. It's just core to who we are, and it's again goes back to the leadership of those most impacted and who we're funding in the community, and those people need to be at the table making the decisions. So Chinravi, I don't know if you want to add anything or give your perspective.
Yeah, so as a New England funding panelist, I hail from Rhode Island, but we have about I don't know how many people now, but we have people from Vermont who represent migrant workers. We have people from Massachusetts who do housing and youth organizing work. We have folks from past funding panelists who are formerly incarcerated from Rhode Island, as well as Somalian refugees from Maine who are on our funding panel. And then right now we don't have anybody from New Hampshire, but we've had people from New Hampshire in the past, and 3 folks from Connecticut. So when we talk about, participatory grant making, we really, and Jamie does a lot of this work, right? The meat of it, outreaching to community members, building relationships with people, and really asking people to take part of this process. So I'm on my 3rd year, right? But I've known about Haymarket since I was a student in college. And so something I do want to share with you all is that, in meeting Haymarket, I was blown away by kind of the collective process of groups coming in, 3 or 4 groups during the interview process, making sure that it is non-competitive. Haymarket makes it very clear that they can fund all the groups, but it's really about deep relationship building across sectors, but also across movements, right? And so because Haymarket highlights the deep relationship building, one thing that Haymarket does really well is able to respond to the community needs, right? So really bringing in people's lived experience to talk about what's happening on the ground, because people on the ground do have a political analysis as well as there's just greater knowledge, because sometimes philanthropists, like Katie said before, are a little bit detached from folks' lived experience. So I think I just would add that little piece to.
And I just want to jump in, and I said this in the chat, but I think it's really important to underline that, like all of our foundations are working to advance justice and equity and have a racial justice frame. And there are so many parallels to the central values of racial justice and racial equity that lead us to the conclusion that participatory grant making is the way to do this work and to drive us there. And I think that coming from a place of, watching the philanthropic sector take this year of uprising and turn it into steps towards greater equity within the grant making space opens up the room and the space to consider different ways of doing grant making and ways to really bring in community into that decision making in all ways.
I think one of the next questions we had on our list, and Sabrina, I'll pass this over to you, is to kind of hear from you, as well as Chinravi. I'd be curious from your perspective around this as well. As a participant, why you're involved in participatory decision making, to kind of hear about that angle. If I can pass that over to you, Sabrina.
Yeah. Well, I think personally, it's definitely, I would recommend if you are involved in like an organization, and so you've been on kind of the flip side of this, where you're looking for grants, you're writing the grants, like going through the application process. I think it's really invaluable to have the opportunity to kind of be on the other side and see kind of into the mind of some of these organizations. You get to learn firsthand maybe like what they're looking for. You can apply that back to your organization and just have that experience on both ends. And I think that's really cool. Like I said earlier, I was involved with a lot of environmental justice and environmental education work in Maine. And so I really did jump at the opportunity to kind of be on the other side of that. And I've enjoyed like my experiences so far. I also think that this is something that, at least personally in the past, like it hasn't been available to me and I haven't had a lot of access to it and I just didn't know about it. So I think that I really like how, the seed grants and the grow grants are operated and how the grant making committees are very call in oriented versus calling out. I think that's kind of like one of the popular narratives in our culture, but you don't really get a lot done a lot of times with call out culture versus when you are able to attract people from like a diverse population for your committee, whether it's people of different races and ethnicities, different socioeconomic status, people of different ability status. There's levels to diversity that also I think are kind of thrown to the wayside, but those are the most valuable committees that I have been on because they allow you to, everyone has a different kind of worldview and a different perspective on how they're reading and viewing the applications. And so even just being on the committees for these past couple of years, I mean, I thought I was doing a good job, but you definitely learn more as you go and as you're hearing other people's perspectives on things or other people's opinions, you're like, okay, that's true. And like, I want to start applying that to my life, whether it's like my organization or just like in general. So it's definitely also a great like learning opportunity as well.
Thanks, Sabrina.
Echo. Sorry, I don't know if I was supposed to go right after.
Yeah,
or...
please, yeah, go ahead.
I'm sorry. So I stepped into Haymarket's funding panel because Haymarket's values are core to my values. Haymarket's 4 values are accountability to constituency and leadership of those most impacted, which is something that I came up with in the work of social justice work as an organizer in Rhode Island through youth organizing. What Haymarket doesn't tell you is that Haymarket funds a lot of youth organizing groups on the low and really think about intergenerational work in that way. Another thing that Haymarket does really well is undoing racism. And so a lot of the young people were able to funnel into undoing racism training by the People's Institute. Haymarket also has a value of grassroots organizing, looking at the systems, having a strong power analysis, asking organizations like, do you have a systems analysis and are you creating power for people on the ground? But also, are you connecting, which is like part of the movement building across New England? And so I deeply appreciated and aligned with a lot of Haymarket's values as a young person, growing up in the movement, and now as an adult, I would say more seasoned and experienced organizer as a participant, really learning across like New England who the populations are that are more, critical to like social justice movements in New England, right? And what areas more how would I say more active in movements like in the national spaces. So I was able to really just get an analysis and assessment of the political landscape and learn about migrant workers in Vermont, learn about the Somalian communities who are newer in Maine, right? Learn about mass like kind of hardcore housing housing work. They're badass at it, and learn about Connecticut's more upcoming work, right? And so I think this really gave me, as a young person coming up in the movement, kind of like a real clear understanding of, how do you build with one another? And Haymarket created spaces for grantees to come across 6 states to meet each other every year. So we were able to really connect and learn from one another and keep building relationships. So one of the people that I did grow up in the movement with was Khalik, who was a youth organizer that came up in Boston, who recently just left Haymarket. So those relationships do form and they stay very long.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And yeah, and I would just add, I think from my perspective as someone who facilitates Haymarker's process, and I think we've all talked, it's a real opportunity for people to a different kind of leadership development, as Chanravi was saying, where you can really kind of have a bigger picture of kind of movements and what's happening, and not just so focused on your individual work. So not only is it, creating power and shifting power, but it's also giving folks the opportunity for leadership development, which is essential to the work we do. So the next question that we want to throw out is, what do you see as your number one benefit and top challenge of participatory grant making? I think we've already highlighted, at least from Haymarket's perspective, a lot of the benefits of doing this work. You have people on the ground who are engaged in the work, making decisions, you're shifting power, we're living with our values, leadership development. So to me, the benefits are endless, and we could spend hours talking about it. The challenges from my perspective as the kind of the grants program director that oversees this is it takes more time. It's not a quick, easy decision. Like main initiatives and New England Grassroots, Haymarket goes through a whole process. We do a weekend retreat where decisions are made. There's, it's more than just a grant cycle and it's done. We work off consensus decision making, which if anyone's experienced that takes even longer. So, for me, it's time and capacity. It's, you're essentially working with, whether you're stipending folks or giving benefits for them engaged, you're essentially working with volunteers who are engaged in this work. So, just being mindful of that and being realistic of what people's capacity is to engage, and just being able to balance all of that with wanting to get decisions to groups. So for me, that's some of the challenges as somebody who staffs this. But I don't know if others want to share kind of your one benefit or top challenges.
I can follow up on that, and I totally agree, Jamie. And I think the two in some ways are linked as well. I think sometimes, and we find there's a lot of funding partners that are asking us more questions and want to really dig into a deeper conversation as to why and how this makes sense. And it's an interesting tension, because yes, it does take a lot more time, and it can feel like it's really not worth it if you were just focusing on that fund not point. Like, isn't it just much more efficient to just have a small group of folks make the decisions and move forward, and they'll probably know enough, et cetera, et cetera. But I think some of the things that I feel I heard Sabrina, you talk about, and Ravi, you as well, that part of the process is the way we look at it is it's a form of field building as well. We have the leaders that are doing the work on the ground, that are engaged in deeper practices and protocols that don't just stay in that room. It's not just in that day or day and a half retreat to make decisions. These people turn around, go back to their own organizations. And I think Sabrina used that directly, like apply some of the things that are happening in that space in their own work. And over time, I think that really makes it incredibly worthwhile, because there is sort of a leadership development component here that is exponential as people are turning. And there's almost like a reimagining of how decision making is possible, where this idea of democracy is so big, especially in this country. But what does that really look like? And I think, Jamie, you highlighted consensus decision making. We apply sociocracy in how we make decisions. These are all sort of opportunities for folks to really intentionally sit with, like, how do I make decisions? Like, how do I really think about how we make decisions impacts equity or not? And these are choices we make that we're not always fully aware of. And we sort of pushed that further and really talked about what we now call our guiding practices. So how do we center just transition? How do we shift power? How do we lower barriers to participation? How to really root the work in the community context? Those are all questions that are really nuanced and very hard. And I think, as Sabrina highlighted, to just be able to sit in a group of folks that will hold different perspectives that will make you go, wait a minute, yeah, I thought I knew, but this is actually, more nuanced, deeper, all of that process in and of itself make that extra time so worthwhile, because that's an experience that I think really we see some of the folks that are through our process come back with projects that are so much deeper, that are so much more aligned with the values that we're all looking to center to really get to the environmental justice outcomes we're looking for. That in and of itself, extra time, challenge of extra time, then also really becomes the benefit, because what comes out of that extra time spent with each other really creates a huge difference.
I'd like to, Andrea, you.
I'll certainly echo what everyone has said, and add in that, from the Maine Initiative's perspective, we see community education. So we do our participatory process in a two-part model, where the first part really is much more about broad community education about who is doing this work, what are the perspectives of this work, and creating a megaphone for all of the organizations who are deeply advancing racial justice in our community, and connecting them to folks who are either just starting to get interested or have been doing this for a long time, and connecting them with folks who they don't have a relationship with before. So kind of building that network and the knowledge of that network, and building individuals. In a lot of cases, for us, it's the well-meaning white folks who are just starting to get into this racial justice work, and creating a process that values individual learning and growth, as well as getting the dollars out the door. And on the flip side for us, we have that set of values, because on the other side, we know that the $250,000 or $500,000 that we're getting out into the community, it's a good amount of money. And I don't want to minimize that amount of money, but that is not going to end racial injustice in our community. So using this process to do all of the things that have just been mentioned, to build the community, to do the education, to change the way that people think about decision making, to push the envelope for, from our perspective, all of us raise our money as well as give out the money. And what can we do in our participatory processes that might influence the larger body of philanthropy, who can have a much bigger footprint, and maybe our experimentation and our pushing of the envelope through participatory grant making can influence those foundations to change the way that they're doing their decision-making processes, to get more money out the door, and to get more money out the door expressly and intentionally to advance justice and equity in our community.
Yes. Wow, Andrea. I think this is a good segue into which is that philanthropy is a strange world. It is filled with contradictions and complexities. And I think that the number one challenge, there are so many, y'all have mentioned the time frames, some of the other challenges around bias and how we address our own, and kind of make sure that we create space for challenging ourselves there. But I do think that the number one challenge that I see in this work is that what legitimacy do we have as people in philanthropy to be doing this work to begin with? And if there is going to be this whole field of philanthropy as we know it, then we have to ask ourselves very honest and difficult questions about how the money came into these spaces, what rights we have to be making decisions about it, et cetera. So these are very, very big questions. And I think it's fair to say that philanthropy is going through a bit of a reckoning now, and has been over the last few years, as we're just seeing these really poignant and important critiques coming from all sorts of wonderful people who are holding up the mirror back to philanthropy. And I think it's an opportunity for us to really learn from it. I truly believe, as a big cheerleader for this work, I do truly believe that there's a big opportunity for us all to engage in collective decision-making processes, to understand what our biases are, what the opportunities are for learning from each other, and to invest in participatory models that do shift power away from those institutions that have traditionally held it. So I think that's both the biggest challenge and also a big opportunity. But I would say that one other benefit that I believe so strongly about participatory approaches is the value of learning. Most of these funds here, I know, are constantly learning from the experiences, asking themselves, asking grants applicants, asking people participating in the process, how did it go? What mistakes did we make? And being really honest about those mistakes, because no matter how many times, y'all have done this work so many times, and I bet no single time is perfect, right? We're learning about ourselves and our process and the work each and every time. And there's space for that. This is all about iteration and growth and learning from that work we do together. So I see one of the biggest benefits is truly being a chance to learn and learn again and learn again together.
I think if it's okay, we'll switch the content, the questions we're asking a little bit more to logistics, because folks often want to kind of get into some of the details of the exactly how does all this work. And I think we'll start with kind of focus on participants, just how do we end up with the participants, we end up with who chooses them, and I think what's the role of paid staff as well. So I'm happy to kind of start from a grassroots perspective. So we, from the get-go, have always had a grant-making committee, and at the start that was 12 to 15 folks that were chosen by staff from, at the time, an all-white staff and networks that existed within that. And about 6-7 years ago, we really reconnected with values, worked with our board to center environmental justice, racial equity as key priorities in the work moving forward. There were some really deep questions around why is that? How do we get beyond sort of this gatekeeping role that staff can potentially play? So we've deliberately decided to go with an open call process, what we call readers. So anybody interested, we do not block anybody. We do ask sort of a low threshold of questions, and we do ask folks to look at our values and uphold our values, or if they need to have a conversation with us, ensure that they can do that. But we really want to just make sure that there's no sort of gatekeeping role and that process is really open. And I think in part that also goes to sort of that multi-movement piece that we want to build as well. How do we really not just kind of put it out with known entities and known partners, but kind of let it go viral, if you will. And that's one of a lot of our readers turning into ambassadors and inviting more of their folks into our process as well over the years. So that's one of the big pieces. I think, Katie, you just said this as well. I think one of the things I really want to make sure and name that for anybody that's interested in getting into some of the logistics of participatory decision making, don't make it a one-year thing, because you're setting yourself up to fail. If you basically say we're going to do one pilot of participatory decision making and then see if it worked or not, because you're starting from where you're at. In your network, I presume in a lot of our funding partners, their networks are predominantly white. They haven't really necessarily connected with some of the organizations that are coming in from a different movement, a different angle, a different perspective. And that takes time to build those relationships. That was mentioned earlier as well, that relationships are the key, and it takes time to that. So it's something that really needs to happen over a multi set of years. This is our 6th year that we've been doing this work, and this it's an exponential effect as readers become ambassadors and more folks are being brought in. That open call is one of the key pieces for us in the way we operationalize environmental justice and really remove barriers for anybody impacted participate. Then when we select our grant-making committee, we really look at, as I mentioned, some of the demographics, asking folks to self-identify across a range of characteristics. And then really kind of look at how do we bring in the perspectives of folks that are doing the work on the ground, that are experiencing the impacts, know what this work looks like, and also, as John Avi mentioned, come from sort of different angles and different movements as well. And that's been incredibly interesting, especially over the last year. We're doing more work within the food system and have a specific program for that we're developing right now. And it's been really interesting to understand more that a lot of folks on the ground don't see themselves as food organizers. So how do you reach out to folks with sort of an invite to talk about the food system when a lot of people don't see themselves as food system organizers, or in the case of mutual, people don't see themselves as mutual aid organizers. So those are real challenges, trying to our networks and trying to think about how do we get to some of the folks and the voices that we want to bring in. So that open call is key for us. Having the readers be ambassadors and broadening is key for us, and really understanding that this is a multi-year, long process that is not going to happen over the next 6 months, and that you start where you're at. You start with the network that you because I think a lot of times in our cases, a lot of the conversations we have with funding partners, there's sort of this vision of, oh, we need to get more people of color in our grant making network. We need to really jump quickly to just a diverse set of issues that we're working on that we've never worked on. And honestly, it just doesn't work. Like I said, it's relationships. It takes time. That's the work that we all need to do. But the barrier to even get going and launch yourselves in there. So leave it there. I don't know, Jamie and Andrea, if you want to jump in, or Sabrina and Chanravi as participants. I'm curious if you have perspectives on what that's like to step into these processes.
Yeah, just to echo like what you were saying towards the end about, I guess, the recruitment process, that's definitely logistically one of, I think, the most important parts of the grant making process, because it all starts with the organization who they can place on these committees. So I think that, being a reader, you read through so many applications and there's always a question of like, okay, but are they working with people in the community? Are they working with as many people as they could? Are they trying to expand their reach? And that really does start at the organization level. And I think that there should always be a conversation on, what perspectives are we missing, or what perspectives would enrich our conversations. And sometimes it could be as simple as, I feel like a lot of organizations say, okay, we need more people of color. Like that's usually what comes up. But I feel like you should also challenge your organization in the way you're thinking in terms of, okay, yes, maybe that is true, but what's the age situation looking like? Like, would we benefit from maybe having a youth voice or a youth participant or an older participant if possible? Would we benefit from maybe having a recent, someone who recently moved to the community versus someone who's been here, and kind of got used to it? Like maybe someone with a new perspective would see things differently or see areas to improve. And then actively try to, recruit in those areas. Not overtly necessarily, because I feel like, going back to what I said earlier, the most common sentence I feel is like, okay, we need more people of color. And so if you do, or if you need, more younger people, maybe try to partner with the school system, or at least, send your resources or send your opportunities to them, or, broaden your wide view, maybe go to different community events or neighborhood events that your organization hasn't gone to in the past, and just try to get the word out there and talk to as many people as possible. That will hopefully increase interest, and then you would end up having a grant making committee that would have just like a better and more expansive perspective and view on things. I think that's really definitely important, and that's kind of a logistical hurdle sometimes. So maybe it's a little off-putting in the beginning, but I do think that the end goal and what you're getting out of it is worthwhile.
I can just jump in very quickly and say that, there's a whole set of like metrics we can apply to how we build. There is no perfect committee. There is no perfect set of folks. But there are, different metrics that we can apply, but nothing is more important to me than the question of who do we know and who do we don't know, and how do they get selected onto this committee. So we select our committee with what we call a sounding board and a steering committee. And those are folks who've gone through our process before and understand the process and have ownership over the process to make decisions about who's going to be selected to be on this next year's committee. And we make a very intentional decision to not have too many, and too many varies what that means, folks who've done this before, to make those open spaces for people who haven't participated before. And also, we always commit to picking at least like 10% of folks on our committee who nobody knows on our selection team. So really intentionally trying to expand the community and the network so that you don't have to be initially connected to one of the folks who's doing this work, who has done it before, but taking a wide pool. I mean, we have on average 350 plus folks who participate in our reader process. And like Bart, it's a totally open call. And then we select a subset of those, about 50 to 60 people, to come to our grant making committee process, and are really committed to making sure that that committee is a reflection of the widest beauty of our community. And so we intentionally pull in folks who are funders and use that as an opportunity to change their perspectives on grant making. And we pull in some of our major donors from main initiatives, but we really focus on bringing in current grant applicants, current grantees, activists in the community, and then this kind of beautiful question mark group of folks who, say something in their application that really moves us, but who we don't know yet, and that shouldn't be a negative in this process.
Chinravi, do you want to add anything about how?
Yeah, so I think like Haymarket kind of organically has an intersectional lens. And so naturally when we do outreach, and mainly I want to say like shout outs to Carla, Jennifer, and Jamie, because they have been doing outreach. They are also organizers, right, in the spaces that they show up. And so when we do outreach, we really like, our grantees in our network, we ask people directly or kind of plant seeds, like you should think about, doing this. Like it is a 3-year commitment. We're very clear that it's a 3-year commitment. And so, we kind of have these conversations, like, oh, I'm interested. Can you talk a little bit more? But it takes people time to, make and create time for the grant making process, because the grant making process is a long process. I also believe in making sure that foundations cover people's costs, right? And Haymarket is really good at looking at people's abilities and looking at that really critically, like who is able to be in space too, right? And so I think I believe that Haymarket has an intersectional, and that is organic, but we don't ever say it, right? We don't name it as intersectional. The other thing is I wanted to, for Bart's comment, I think everybody became food organizers during the public health crisis. I just want to be honest with you. We were all out there putting food together, giving out food, distributing mutual aid. So in many ways, the public health crisis really uplifted participatory grant making as one of the core strategies to really redistributing resources to community organizations. Like Haymarket really adapted, adjusted, and there was a quick turnaround of resources to the ground. We were just like, hey, we're going to shorten the process for grant making. We're going to check in with you after the public health crisis, but we're not going to make this long drawn out situation, because it was a crisis, right? And so in that way, Haymarket was able to be fluid and adaptive to grantees. And I think that that was really, really helpful. And because of the deep relationships that we had, we all trusted each other and was like, okay, let's do this, right? From board to past board members to former grantees, everybody jumped in. And so when we talk about process, we always have somebody, there's never someone alone. It's always somebody else from Haymarket, because accountability and transparency is so critical, and that practice is very much embedded into the organization. So.
Yeah, and I'll just add from the perspective what's staff role in this work. So at Haymarket, we're the grants department of one. We're small, so there's not many of us. And my role really is the facilitator of the process. I'm not a decision maker at all. I bring the information, I organize it, I help facilitate things. But the decision making at Haymarket explicitly lies with the funding panel, and that's true. So staff can't trump any funding panel decision. The board can't trump any funding panel decision. And we feel that's necessary to be, to the integrity of our process, that, we're not asking people to come in and spend all this time to make decisions, and then that can be trumped or taken away by somebody. So really as staff, I see myself as the facilitator of our grant making process, but the decision making lies with our funding panel.
I love that. Another question around logistics that many of us often get is, how do you justify the costs of participation? It's a juicy question. I often want to ask, how do you justify the cost of not having participation? Because I think a lot of these questions that you'll hear again and again really do need to be examined. So for instance, when I get these questions from folks, it's often from folks coming from institutions who do have paid staff for philanthropy. Not all philanthropy is run by paid staff, but many times it is. And so I think in that kind of situation, we have to be clear about the costs already invested in staff. I believe staff play an important administration, facilitation, analysis lens. Jamie, you just spoke to that. But in general, I think it's key to do what Chanravi mentioned is important: compensate people who are coming into these roles. This is something some funders do and other funders don't, and I know there's many complex reasons for that. It is a cost, but I believe it's a very, very important cost. If philanthropy is really trying to move to a justice model, if philanthropy is trying to shift power, if philanthropy is trying to achieve equity, then compensating people for their time and efforts, especially if they're coming from a lived expertise of injustice, is absolutely critical. So I think that it's a cost, it's a real cost, and it's an important one to make that serves our ultimate goal of justice. I think some of the other costs that we see coming up are around face-to-face gatherings. Many of the funders here spoke today about those. Those do cost money, it's true. And if we also think about the outcomes of movement building and of meaningful engagement and learning opportunities that come out of these experiences, I believe they strongly justify the costs. COVID has taught many of us here and everyone that we can do virtual meetings. Those generally have lower costs. But I think some of the impacts of what you see coming out of those virtual experiences are meaningful, but perhaps not quite as joyful as those face-to-face experiences that allow that meaningful, deep, perhaps lifelong connections between participants. Those are some of the costs that we do see coming up. But again, I believe that all of the costs are well in service of the goals. I'm not sure if anyone else wants to speak of the costs.
I think you covered a lot of the costs really well, Katie. I completely agree. I think one of the things that we can sometimes sit with, especially as we build these committees that have different levels of understanding, different perspectives, different lived experiences, etc. There's almost an emotional cost of being part of the process, and that's one of the ones that we want to really be sensitive around and really create. Trauma can come up in these conversations. We talk about lived experience. We talk about people that have different lived experience, and sometimes comments can really trigger in a big way. So that's the challenge of the work, and that cost is also, it's not the financial cost, it's that emotional cost of participating. And how do we really create spaces that care, spaces that center solidarity, spaces that center healing in many ways as well, that take a lot of work, a lot of nuance, and I think is just such a key piece. You mentioned this as well, working with a selection committee. We work with a planning committee ahead of our grant-making committee. That planning committee also selects the folks that are in that grant-making committee, and they facilitate a lot of the spaces as well. And I think that's an ongoing conversation with those folks, like how does this space really honor the healing that needs to happen, and the conversations that emerge as they emerge, and how can we pivot as some of those things happen as well, and sometimes stop the process and say we need to tend to this. That cost is very real and needs to be highlighted.
I will just throw in that, like, compensating folks can mean additional lots of things beyond the money as well. Like, we try and add in essentially an extra day or two of vacation. We bring everyone to the Schoodic Institute, which I think somebody is here from them. And we offer extra days of vacation up there in Acadia National Park as part of the healing and the restoration process from going through the grant process. We do a big lobster bake, and we want to treat people. The nonprofit sector is so told to, like, serve everybody cold pizza and, be in the basement of whatever building you're in, and be in those spaces that are not as comforting and welcoming. And it's that much harder to recover from the trauma and the stress of doing difficult things and having hard conversations. than if you're in a place where you feel valued and you feel seen and heard and respected. And so, it is a cost, but it is a critical cost from our perspective to make sure that it is a holistic, whole person experience for folks going through the grant making process. And we've talked about costs, and I think this pushes us to a next question in our logistics conversation, which is about success. We have lots of definitions about what success looks like, but for grant making, typically we would say that success is making good grants. And I'm really interested to hear from this group about, when you're thinking about success and having a successful grant making process, what are those metrics? What are the things that you're looking at that really have do you have a broader definition of success beyond good grants?
I think on a big picture level, we see the success of our grantees and the work that's happening on the ground and the systemic change work that's happening. So you can see, for a range of issues in that have played out, in different states. In Vermont, Haymarket had some of the seed funding in some of those movements. So that's just kind of the broader thing. But then just measuring, and we're actually in the middle of our own evaluation, just measuring kind of, since we've shifted our focus to anti-racism, kind of the impact of that work and seeing kind of how we're having deeper impact than just, the transactional giving money. And then I think the success, living to our values and having the participatory grant making is I think we've kind of all talked about it anecdotally, like the leadership, the connection, the relationship building, the deepness of the issues, like that's all success. Like, we're not just, it's Haymarket's tagline is change, not charity. Like, we're not here just to be giving out resources or, just to write a check and say we did something good. Like, we're really trying to create change. And to us, that's all part of the success. So it's not just like numbers and widgets, but it's really seeing the impact of people, seeing the leadership of people, and making all of those connections are essential to us.
Yeah, I very much echo that. And that's tough. And we've definitely not had the capacity to really dig into that a little bit more. We now, as of the start of the year, have a position called our Director of Learning, which is a very cool title, jealous, in Sarah Huang, and she's up some of the sort of the processes and the pieces where we can track some of the impacts beyond better, which I think we are absolutely seeing. We're seeing just a huge jump in number of applications, as well as just folks that are not traditionally coming from the environmental world. We're seeing just a much broader group of folks recognizing themselves. Like I said earlier, that food organizer at Ravi, I completely agree. Everybody was a food organizer throughout COVID and still is in many ways. But there's that challenge, right, of guidelines and something saying, well, this is about food system work. And people then say, I just don't really think that's for me. Or, Ravi, I think you mentioned this as well, just the housing work that needs to happen as well. Or, food insecurity work, but really define economic justice that traditionally wasn't going to find their way to something called the Grassroots Environment Fund, because people kind of said, well, this is not environment work. Why would we even bother? And that's what we're starting to really shift as readers become those ambassadors and are starting to be the voice on the ground and encourage folks. They're like, no, they are. They're really open. That process is really open to the work that you're doing. And those are some of the pieces that we really want to push forward. As well as the relationships that we want to track better, and just that leadership development that happens. And I think, Sabrina, you already mentioned as well, like, what do you take back from the work that you do as you're participating in the process as well? Sabrina, I don't know if you have any further thoughts on sort of success from a participant perspective.
I think for me, as a participant, one method of success is if I feel that like the specific organization, after we've, either like evaluated their application, if they match kind of like the guidelines of the grant giving organization, or match like their tenets or their key components, I just feel like that's successful because I like facilitating relationships between organizations that I feel like have the same goals or have the same kind of, I don't know how to say it, I guess have the same metrics or have the same guiding principles. Those relationships, I think, could last longer in the future and they're more sustainable. And so I always feel good when we are partnering with like those organizations that are on a similar wavelength, because I think that that opens the door for like future participation and collaboration as well. Yeah. And then going off on that, if no one else has anything else to say about the previous question, our next one is, how do you see the impact of participating?
I would want to center in answering that. I would want to center the experience of the people who are participating. And if we're thinking here about the decision makers, the grant decision makers, or the applicants, I think getting back to that learning question, so much of this is about creating real space for feedback and for learning from each other. And so asking people who participate, how was this for you? Not assuming it was a good experience. A lot of us, I think, are real supporters of this because we've seen it work in many spaces, but we really do want to make sure we use a do no harm lens. And so I think making sure that we're asking people about what was gained or lost from participating in the experience, and understanding what benefits, if any, came out of this are really important to ask. And there are all sorts of fun ways that people engage in that conversation, but having that trusting relationship in place is required. Otherwise, you continue to deal with very real power dynamics.
Anyone else want to jump in on that question of what do you see as the value of participating?
I mean, I would just say, back to previous points, that I think the value of participating is definitely the learning aspect of it, because the more that you participate and continue to call in, the more you'll learn. And I think the better the process will go. And also the easier the process is to facilitate, which also helps like the organization, like logistically.
Great. If it's okay with all of you, I think it makes sense for us to answer a question or two, and then we can close out with the one tip that we want to give folks. All right, so Jesse is asking a question in the chat, and I want to encourage folks who are listening, putting questions in the Q&A makes it a lot easier for us to find. So if you have a question, to drop it in there. And Jesse is asking, do organizations engaged in participatory grant making have a different relationship to endowments and investments than traditional foundations? So how do you relate to the power and exploitation that's often central to the creation and maintenance of foundations' wealth? Which is an amazing question. I can jump in the beginning here, which is that I know all three of our foundations are fundraising foundations. So we raise money from the community, often from other foundations, and wealthy donors and small dollar donors. At Main Initiatives, the vast majority of our donors make gifts of under $100 to build up the way that we function and our work. And so that does mean we have a pretty substantially different relationship to the typical foundation endowment model. That said, we do have a small endowment, and at the same time as we're trying to really push the boundaries of our grant making and decision making, we're trying to push the boundaries of what it means to have an endowment. And we have really done a deep dive into an individual stock by stock screen, not just on your standard economics and environmental impact and gender equity models, but like a very detailed screen of tolerance of different types of processes within, within stocks on the market and businesses and their practices. And we're engaging in some very intentional impact investing. So using our endowment as another avenue to get money directly into communities by making very low interest loans to, right now, predominantly to CDFIs in the community. So the Genesis Community Fund, to Four Directions Development Corporation, to the Cooperative Fund of New England, organizations who match our values directly, where we can support them through a small, through a grant that's actually bigger than any grant we're able to give out, through a loan that they can then leverage to bring more money into the community. So trying very hard to balance all of those different pieces together. Does anybody else want to jump in on that question?
Yeah, really briefly, as you said,
Yeah.
we don't have an endowment. We have a relatively small reserve that's slowly growing, but it's the same thing. And I think that's where participatory decision making as sort of an ethos doesn't just stop at the grant making side of things. It's something that permeates throughout the entire organization in who's hired and how people are hired, who's on the board. Those selection processes happen, and the same here in looking where is some of the money that we have invested. For us, is the same thing. Community development loan funds, RSF finance is another vehicle that we use in order to really be aligned with our values and ensure that where we can, we're really impacting. Like I said, it's just throughout the entire organization who we engage with when we have in-person events. At some point, where do we put those dollars? When we bring in caterers, where do those dollars go? How do we really think about every decision that's being made and how that aligns with our values and centered equity?
Anyone else? Looks like no. Okay.
Haymarket, it's very similar, so I don't want to.
So we'll go to this one other question from Suzanne, and then we'll close things out as we're getting close to 2:15. This one is, so how do you curate the grantee and fundee participation to cultivate an ecosystem of power and value building versus seeing each other as competition? So what are the principles and agreements that ensure that? That's a giant question. So just want to ask everyone to kind of give a snippet of that. But essentially, how do you prevent the competition aspect from coming into this process?
I feel like Chinrabi, you touched on this a little bit with our interview process. Do you want to share more of that, or?
Yeah, so I think when we're in the process of interviewing grantees, we always, let folks know, and we are very transparent. We're saying this is not a competition. We have enough money to fund everybody. This is more about relationship building, because people usually come in with their guards up, but it's also about building solidarity, like Bart was saying. Like, how do we continue to build solidarity with one another? This year was a little different because we were able to do things on Zoom. So we were able to connect people with their sector, right? So education-based work was able to connect to all the education-based organizations in New England. And then the housing folks were able to connect with the housing, folks doing stuff across New England. And so people were able to really see their work in other people's work. And I think that was strategic in Jamie's part, because she was like, well, I have a little bit of flexibility in putting people together. I'm like, that's awesome, because usually when she comes down to Rhode Island, which is where I'm from, we all just kind of go in the whole, we already know each other because we're so small. But if you go into other spaces, they might not know each other and they might feel competitive, right? But along the line, because we usually don't often fund people at one time. We fund people for a long period of time, sustaining grants. The relationship, people start getting to see each other over and over again, and so those walls start to come down. And then folks naturally are in coalition with one another outside of foundation work, right, and fundraising and stuff like that. So people already have a solidarity practice. And so I think that Haymarket has a solidarity practice of we're not in competition with one another, we're in solidarity with one another. We'll get through the hard conversations. And we also have a really strong conflict of interest, policy, both for folks who are on the panel and how we kind of move and how we fund people. like for example, like I was a part of Sister Fire. I just transitioned out that the Haymarket Fund Sister Fire. So, I'm not allowed to be in the interview process or read the grant and all that stuff. But I was also part of the Province Youth Student Movement. So, there's like, there's this conflict of interest when you're working with folks who are from on the ground, because people will volunteer for different organizations. And so there's, checks and balances that Haymarket has in place. But we always go in with the intention of like, we're building solidarity amongst one another. This is not a competition. And I think that like this, it's over time, and over time creates more like deeper relationships that everybody was saying. And so it just takes time.
Thank you. It is 2:15 on the dot, and so I actually want to start this question for Katie, who I know needs to pop off right away. So just to close everyone out, what's your one tip and a quick tip that we want to offer to folks in getting started with participatory grant making?
My one tip is to just try it with a little help from your friends. Use the community of practice that all of you are welcome to join. There is a website, participatorygrantmaking.org, and this grant craft guide. So just try
it. Sabrina, you want to go next?
Yes. So my tip would be think about your community, whether it's the community that you're actively serving or a community that you would like to be more involved in, and make sure that your leadership and your grant makers replicate that community.
Bart.
I would say, it's an ethos that stretches throughout, and it's a daily practice that shows up day in, day out in all ways. And I'm squeezing in 3. I'm really cheating here. Commit for like years, for a long period of time. Don't just pilot it and decide it works or doesn't work. Like, really commit.
Awesome. Jamie.
I would just encourage you to, be doing participate, if the theme that follows is, this process matches the values and who we are. So just really having that brought into your thought process behind that. And then I'm going to cheat too. And then just transparency, the people you're bringing in, how you're doing your process, just making sure everybody understands it. I think that's really important.
Great. Chanravi.
Communication, clarity, and trust the process.
Awesome. And I'll say, don't be afraid to try and fail and learn from that, because it's an iterative process and you're always going to make a mistake, but make a new mistake next time. I want to thank everybody. And if you want to drop in appreciations for everyone in the chat, I know we'll all love to see that because we didn't get to see your faces. Thank you to all of you for joining this conversation. It's so powerful. And I can say, it is amazing to know that we're not all alone in doing this, that we're all doing this and we're connected. And we invite everybody to come in and join the participatory grant making movement here in Maine and in the Northeast and across the country. So thanks, everybody.